I come to this magnificent house of worship tonight because my conscience leaves me no other choice. A time comes when silence is betrayal. That time has come for us in relation to Vietnam.
Martin Luther King knew when he gave that speech that it would set off a firestorm.
It's the speech that challenges us, and in that sense, it's his most important. That we are uncomfortable with that speech tells us something.
Why are you speaking about the war, Dr. King? Why are you joining the voices of dissent? Peace and civil rights don't mix, they say. So such questions mean that the inquirers have not really known me, my commitment or my calling. Indeed, their questions suggest that they do not know the world in which they live.
With this speech, Dr. King risked everything he'd worked so hard to accomplish. In its aftermath, all hell broke loose. Already off the list of the most admired Americans, now the mainstream media turned against him, and even civil rights leaders publicly condemned him.
Oh, they dumped all over him, and he was having such a tough time in those last years.
He had hit the jugular vein. He had, in that one speech, summoned the conscience of the nation.
It did exactly what he wanted it to do. It shook the establishment deeply.
The real king, the unknown king, the king that loved so deeply he was dangerous in the eyes of the FBI. Got to remember.
In this hour, in conversations with those who knew him best, we'll grapple with just who this man really was, and with the powerful and challenging message of one of his greatest but little-known speeches, Beyond Vietnam.
But it was precisely 1 year to the day after this speech that bullet, which had been chasing him for a long time, finally caught up with him. And I am convinced that bullet had something to do with that speech.
Hello, and thank you for joining me. I'm here in the historic Riverside Church in New York City, where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered what most agree was his most challenging and controversial call to conscience. When he spoke here on April 4, 1967, 1 year to the day before he would be killed in Memphis, every pew, every available space was jammed with listeners. In the midst of an increasingly unpopular war in Asia, and a year already filled with oftentimes violent outbursts of rage in American cities, Dr. King once again dedicated himself to nonviolence. But that call to peace was not what made this speech so courageous. It was, rather, his insistence that our war in Vietnam was destroying the soul of America, and that only by ending the bombing, bringing home U.S. troops, and focusing on the needs of the poor and disenfranchised right here at home could America, with all of her promise, survive.
Some of us who have already begun to break the silence of the night have found that the calling to speak is often a vocation of agony, but we must speak. We must speak with all the humility that is appropriate to our limited vision, but we must speak.
Martin Luther King Jr. delivered hundreds of speeches, preached a sermon almost every Sunday of his adult life.
You're too arrogant.
Two of his most famous speeches are as familiar as any in American history.
I have a dream that we as a people will get to the promised land.
Those speeches have been analyzed and memorized, but the speech he gave here at the Riverside Church, urging nonviolent reconciliation in a time of war and a renewed commitment to economic and social justice, is the one that arguably has the most to teach us today as we search for honorable resolutions to the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan and seek to narrow the gap between rich and poor here at home. Marion Wright Edelman was a young lawyer working on behalf of the poor in Mississippi when Dr. King decided to speak out against the Vietnam War.
He said over and over again, both in the speech and other times, about the betrayal of silence. And obviously he had been struggling with this for a long time, and, you know, and I'm sure he had thought through all the things that would be said about how he's diverting attention from the civil rights movement. But he said, yeah, he struggled. But he was obviously also a very honest man who tried to work his way through what the gospel and the prophets demanded of him and to try to live with that.
We as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society, when machines and computers, profit motives and property rights are considered more important than people. The giant triplets of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered.
Beyond Vietnam was a frank, no-holds-barred speech in which Dr. King took on the architects of the war and challenged the policies not only of President Johnson, but of Presidents Kennedy and Eisenhower, every administration that had a hand in the conflict.
Somehow this madness must cease. We must stop now. I speak as a child of God and brother to the suffering poor of Vietnam. I speak for the poor of America who are paying the double price of smashed hopes at home, death and corruption in Vietnam. I speak as a citizen of the world, for the world as it stands aghast at the path we have taken. I speak as one who loves America, to the leaders of our own nation. The great initiative in this war is ours. The initiative to stop it must be ours.
His conscience leaves him no choice. That he had reached a point where he had to break the silence. And we know that when silence replaces the truth, the silence itself is a lie. Martin Luther King Jr. was the kind of brother, the kind of human being, the kind of Christian, the kind of free black man where he refused to live a lie.
It's challenging from a distance now of more than 40 years to remember what our country looked like in 1965, 66, 67, when the escalating war in Vietnam and the continuing struggle for civil rights seemed to turn this country into warring factions. It's now almost universally acknowledged that the Vietnam War was a mistake. Even wartime Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara conceded that before his death in 2009.
There is a uniformly accepted view that the war in Vietnam was wrong. Most people accept the fact that we lost the war. There's a few who still say, no, we didn't really lose. I don't know exactly what they think happened, but everybody agrees that it was a bad war.
But at the time, many insisted America was making an important stand against communism, and that to question an ongoing war was tantamount to treason. So when Dr. King told his inner circle that he was going to publicly condemn the war in no uncertain terms, there was immediate blowback. Many of his closest advisors questioned whether or not he realized what he was doing. Dr. King's friend and ally, Harry Belafonte, remembers.
I believe very strongly that Dr. King understood with great clarity what it was he was getting into once he cross-pollinated our movement with the efforts of the peace movement and the resistance to the war in Vietnam. He was not just speaking philosophically towards the issues of peace, but he's also speaking very strongly to the issues of American political policy.
It was that decision to speak out about war policy that made so many in the civil rights movement angry. Why take on the Vietnam War when the fight for civil rights was still to be won? And most importantly, why incur the wrath of President Lyndon Johnson, a man many considered to be the best civil rights president since Lincoln, and a man who had seemingly forged an important alliance with Dr. King?
One of the great tributes that we can pay in memory of President Kennedy is to try to enact some of the great progressive policies that he sought to initiate.
Well, I'm going to support them all, and you can count on that, and I'm going to do my best to get other men to do likewise, and I'll have to have y'all's help. I never needed more than I do now.
Well, you know you have it, and just feel free to call on us for anything.
Thank you so much, Martin.
All right.
Call me when you're down here next time.
I certainly will.
Here was a man who legislatively put on the table the very architectural structure that allowed Dr. King's dreams to breathe.
And the question was, should we publicly oppose him? Should we put ourselves at loggerheads with Johnson, who had done so much for us with civil rights?
Was confronting the powers of this country. You know, and I had friends, too, who said, you can't criticize the president must know what he's doing. And I heard from my father, if Abraham can criticize God over the decision to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, then how can you not criticize the president? Look what he's doing. And I felt, so this was Abraham. This was Abrahamic, this was prophetic, this was the Bible alive.
The rift was so deep that even his own organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, tried to silence him. And for a while, Dr. King was unsettled by that.
I think that a lot of people don't realize that Dr. King made a dry run at his opposition to the war in Vietnam in 1965, but he was soundly defeated in the premises he put forth. People in the media beat him down, said he was actually betraying America. Civil rights leadership argued against him. His own board of the SCLC issued a letter for public consumption saying, we disagree with the leader of our organization in regard to Vietnam. I mean, Dr. King was in a very compromised and untenable position.
By 1967, some 600,000 American men were fighting in Vietnam, with 2,000 U.S. casualties reported every week. Funding that civil rights leaders hoped would go to the war on poverty was instead going to the war in Vietnam. Dr. King realized, whatever the risk to his reputation, that he could no longer be silent.
He wasn't, a Lone Ranger solo gunslinger. He was part of a cavalry. Coretta Scott King was involved in the peace movement far before Martin Luther King Jr. Stokely Carmichael was pushing him very hard. So that there were a number of people who were arguing that Martin Luther King Jr. as the signal and powerful symbol of the civil rights movement and the Nobel laureate for peace should actually be involved in trying to push for peace.
But the question remained, where to give that speech?
The whole purpose of the Riverside Church speech was to cushion what he expected was going to be the negative politics for his speech 10 days later at the United Nations up in New York, where Stokely Carmichael was going to speak and a lot of radicals, and they were going to be carrying Viet Cong flags. And his advisors, who didn't want him to come out against Vietnam at all, said, if you're going to make that march, try to do something first that frames your argument in a way that it won't be distorted, so that you can get your point across. The Riverside Church was designed to be a clear statement, but in a religious context that would be respectful and therefore generate the maximum amount of attention to what Dr. King had to say, and it didn't work.
I deem it of signal importance to try to state clearly, and I trust concisely, why I believe that the path from Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, the church in Montgomery, Alabama, where I began my pastorate, leads clearly to this sanctuary tonight.
It was one of the few speeches that King did not solely write himself, and unlike his sermons, which were often delivered extemporaneously, King read beyond Vietnam from a carefully constructed text. The text itself actually went through revision after revision, as many of his closest aides all took turns writing and rewriting.
I don't think there was any speech that Dr. King ever gave that was as labored as this one was in his preciseness of thought and what he wanted to impart.
Clarence Jones, King's longtime friend and lawyer, was one of those who wrote a draft of the speech, which Dr. King quickly rejected.
He says, "Clarence, I thought you were my radical." I said, "I don't quite understand what you mean." He says, "What is this? You go on and state the issue in the war, and then you say, but on the other hand." And then you go on and state it, and you say, but on the one hand and the other hand. He says, "Clarence, you above all people should know that the Vietnam War is either morally right or morally wrong. It's not on the one hand or on the other hand."
To get the speech he wanted, Dr. King then turned to one of his closest friends, Vincent Harding. He's credited with writing the basic framework of the speech, which King then embellished.
That legal folder that's sitting on your lap, what have you inside that folder?
Okay, well, this is my file for that first draft of the speech that was delivered in this place.
Can I touch this?
You may touch it, but don't touch it too hard.
Wow. I'm immediately stunned because this obviously is a piece of history, the first draft of the speech. And for whatever changed in the draft as you and Dr. King worked on it, this first line stayed the same. "I come to this magnificent house of worship tonight because my conscience leaves me no other choice." Tell me why that first line, which pretty much sums it all up, didn't change in the subsequent drafts.
Martin knew that he wanted to speak from that position, not just as an anti-Vietnam leader, but as a man, a citizen of conscience. We say in the speech, but dealing with Vietnam is not enough. That what we're doing in Vietnam is indicative of a spirit, of an attitude, of a history that could lead us into similar, deep, disastrous mistakes in the future. This is a case of getting out of a certain frame of mind, of a way of thinking about ourselves and thinking about the world. And beyond Vietnam meant we've got to go in that direction.
On April 4th, the Riverside Church was standing room only. Every pew was jammed with supporters. Another 1,200 extra seats were brought in and were quickly filled. Hundreds more stood outside, hoping for a chance to hear Dr. King. One of those in the church that day in '67 was the young daughter of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. Her father was one of Dr. King's closest friends and allies. The Reverend and the Rabbi had walked together in Selma, had stood side by side as proponents of nonviolence, and had championed the poor and disenfranchised. They both studied the Bible and saw it as a living text.
And the question my father worried about was, what will it do to the civil rights movement? Everyone knew Dr. King would be attacked. Should my father, morally, was it right for him to encourage Dr. King to speak out against the war?
How did he navigate, to your point now, knowing that his friend, Martin King, when he came to Riverside to give that speech, was going to be demonized?
My father knew that Dr. King meant every word of what he came to say at Riverside Church. Yes, it takes courage, and it's very difficult, but he also knew that Dr. King believed in this and wanted to do it. My father would never try to convince him to say anything that he didn't believe in. And I think that speech and that evening exemplified a phrase that my father used: moral grandeur and spiritual audacity.
It was a speech that questioned the morality of an ongoing war and insisted that unrestricted war funding would derail social reforms at home, education, jobs, and lifting Americans out of poverty. Although other King speeches were filmed in their entirety, less than 10 minutes of film remained from the Riverside Church. We only know King's powerful delivery thanks to the audio recordings that were made.
It seemed as if there was a real promise of hope for the poor, both black and white, through the poverty program. There were experiments, hopes, new beginnings. Then came the build-up in Vietnam, and I watched this program broken and eviscerated as if it was some idle political plaything of a society gone mad on war.
We wanted to show that there's a linkage between the war and what's going on with Black America, that the war was interfering with that. The war, that Lyndon Johnson wanted to have it both ways. He wanted to do good things for the domestic agenda, for the Great Society, but he also wanted to have the war.
It was a speech that asked if fear had turned Americans into bullies.
Communism will never be defeated by the use of atomic bombs and nuclear weapons. That is nothing except a tragic death wish to prevent us from reordering our priorities so that the pursuit of peace will take precedence over the pursuit of war.
This speech was radical in the sense that it gave a pointed, accusing reminder of how far we had strayed from his main message, that nonviolence and democracy are a glove on a hand. They fit together, and war was corrupting our promise, the promise of freedom.
It was a speech that said nonviolence wasn't weakness and that retaliation wasn't strength, a position that remains as controversial today as it was then.
There are those who think that your father's philosophy, King's philosophy, espoused in this place in 1967, wouldn't work, obsolete in today's world.
I don't agree. People felt the same way in the past. They felt the same way about communism and about Vietnam and the threat that it posed. I've heard this in my own life. A lot of people thought nonviolence was hopeless against people like Bull Connor.
And Hitler.
And Hitler. My father was not an absolute pacifist. He knew that there are times when you must go and rescue people, and it may take force of arms. But he also believed that first you have to try as hard as you can with other methods. If I could see the miracle, really the miracle that Dr. King worked in this country, how he transformed us, can't it work in other settings? I can't say that it can't. How could I?
It's a speech that resonates today as we grapple with wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and ask ourselves if the current conflicts are a repetition of Vietnam, a charge that many, including Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, strongly reject.
For those who don't like the comparison and absolutely reject the comparison between Vietnam and Afghanistan, you're not one of them, but give me your sense of why this subject of comparing the two is so touchy.
For those who think that the war in Afghanistan is a necessary war, and for many, a good war, they don't want to hear that comparison. On the immediate level, in terms of what President Obama himself faces, there is certainly the analogy with Vietnam as it emerged as a quagmire that was just sucking up the costs, the attention of this country that destroyed the Great Society programs, the Great Poverty programs that might have transformed race and poverty in this country.
Perhaps a more tragic recognition of reality took place, and it became clear to me that the war was doing far more than devastating the hopes of the poor at home. It was sending their sons and their brothers and their husbands to fight and to die in extraordinarily high proportions relative to the rest of the population. We were taking the black young men who had been crippled by our society and sending them to guarantee liberties in Southeast Asia, which they had not found in Southwest Georgia and East Holland.
So King responding to what was going on in Vietnam as a direct relationship to what was going on in Black America, he began to add the numbers up, and the mathematics was miserable for black people. Disproportionate numbers of black people are being sent to the front. In 1965, they lowered the educational standard for entry into the military and admitted black people that they had previously kept out. What is that, affirmative retroaction? So it was stunning for King to witness that black people were dying in disproportionate numbers on fields of rice and paddies that were napalmed, but couldn't come back home and enjoy the basic decency of American citizenship. And he said, look, I've spent my life fighting segregation. I'm not going to segregate my conscience.
In Beyond Vietnam, Dr. King also addressed another one of the most important issues with which he had been grappling: how, as a proponent of nonviolence, he could remain silent about an ongoing war.
My third reason moves to an even deeper level of awareness, for it grows out of my experience in the ghettos of the North over the last 3 years, especially the last 3 summers. As I have walked among the desperate, rejected, and angry young men, I have told them that Molotov cocktails and rifles would not solve their problems. I have tried to offer them my deepest compassion while maintaining my conviction that social change comes most meaningfully through nonviolent action. But they ask, and rightly so, what about Vietnam? And I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government.
Dr. King was well aware that a younger generation of leaders was calling nonviolence obsolete. His good friend Stokely Carmichael, a founding member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, coined a term that would, for a while, redefine the movement.
What do you mean when you shout black power to these people back here?
I mean that the only way that black people in Mississippi will create an attitude where they will not be shot down like pigs, where they will not be shot down like dogs, is when they get the power of where they constitute a majority in counties to institute justice.
Dr. King understood their anger, but could not agree to their tactics. As many cities erupted with violence, and as the mainstream media seized on what they called urban riots, Dr. King sought to reach out to those who said that he had lost touch with his times. Harry Belafonte remembers the aftermath of one such meeting.
I just said to him, what troubles you, Martin? And he says, well, he said, you know, I just came from that meeting with the young people in Newark. And they said much that challenged me. And they made great justification for why they saw violence as an important tool to their liberation. My task was to take the truths that they were experiencing, the pain they were experiencing, and say, there is another way. And when I left, I felt that I had not convinced them, that I had not gotten to them in the way in which I would have loved to have gotten to them.
Riverside Church was one of the most famed houses of worship in the country. Completed in 1929 with funds from John D. Rockefeller Jr., the Gothic edifice attracted wealthy and influential individuals from all walks of life. Dr. King had preached here many times. However, even with its tradition of liberalism, the Riverside Church in 1967 was not without de facto segregation. African Americans were not welcome at the front of the church. Gwendolyn Shepard, a childhood friend of the man she called ML, was in the pews that night.
Yeah, they didn't want me sitting up here. I said, I sit here, or he and I both will leave. And that's how I used to get to sit wherever I wanted to when he spoke.
We all know that literally 1 year to the day after he speaks here in your church, April 4, 1967, he's shot dead. I raised that to ask whether or not, to the best of your recollection, that was the last time you saw him speak in person here at Riverside.
That is right.
It is true.
That is true.
Beyond Vietnam was a long speech, more than 45 minutes. When Dr. King finished, the crowd at Riverside Church erupted in sustained applause. But that support was short-lived. By morning, the political fallout was intense and far-reaching. the already strained relationship between President Johnson and Dr. King became fractured beyond repair. Donations to King's organization, SCLC, began to dry up, and the mainstream press denounced him in no uncertain terms, charging that as a civil rights leader, he wasn't qualified to evaluate U.S. foreign policy.
Is there anything that Dr. King and his handlers, his organizers, could have done differently on that night beyond the words that he uttered that might have changed the way he was maltreated the next day, or was the place irrelevant, the audience irrelevant, and it just rests on his words, and wherever he uttered that speech, he would have caught the same hell the next day?
I think so. I think he would have caught the same firestorm against him. Because what they said was not only, we don't like your message, we're in the middle of a war, and we don't want to hear somebody say that we're violent, but it also said, you're a civil rights leader, you're a black guy. Stick to what you know and leave the war to us. It united the New York Times and the Washington Post. A war critic and a war supporter. They both said he'll never be respected again. Shut up and go back to talking about we shall overcome.
The Washington Post said this: many who listened to him with respect will never again accord him the same confidence. He has diminished his usefulness to his cause, to his country, and to his people. The New York Times claimed the fusion of the two issues could very well be disastrous for both causes. But as sharp as those assessments were, they probably did not sting as much as the criticism that came from many of Dr. King's colleagues within the civil rights movement itself.
Dr. King saw the world through a door, not through a keyhole. I mean, the civil rights leaders were so much more limited, and they attacked him along with the major media and the White House and the Democratic Party, saying that you had taken attention away from civil rights by focusing on the war in Vietnam. He said the reality is the war on poverty and money is going to the war in Vietnam.
I remember one day, just because they were all attacking him, why is he hurting civil rights, why is he speaking about something he doesn't know anything about, or that's not our business, as if he sort of was not a citizen, and that we were not, it wasn't our children who were dying in Vietnam, killing other people's children.
You get the sense that they were angered by this Negro getting out of his lane. Foreign policy is not the lane, Dr. King, that we have allowed you or want you to run in. And that comes through pretty clear to me, at least in my reading of it. Did you read the same thing?
With one definition.
Okay.
If Dr. King had stepped into the foreign policy issue and said, I approve of all that you do, he'd have been exalted as a man of vision who leads his people in truth, and he is married to the best in American political goals. No, what he did was to do the unthinkable and the undesirable, was that as a black man, first of all, to reveal that he had the capacity to think and to do analysis and could read history and could speak to global issues with great clarity. And he could also take on the establishment and say, shame on you.
As if the weight of such a commitment to the life and health of America were not enough, I cannot forget that the Nobel Peace Prize was also a commission.
When we first started thinking again about the Beyond Vietnam speech and how it might have relevance for us today, it was clear to us that those who we spoke with would have to deal with the intersection of the two most influential and iconic African-American men in U.S. history, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and President Barack Obama. We can only speculate on how Dr. King, age 81, were he alive today, might advise President Obama on issues of Iraq, Afghanistan, and the growing division here at home between rich and poor. But considering that Dr. King devoted his life to speaking for the poor and to advocating for nonviolence no matter how challenging the conflict, some conclusions seem reasonable.
I have no doubt if he was here to be calling for a poor people's campaign. We now have almost 40 million poor people and 14.5 million poor children. Majority of the poor today are working, playing by the rules, can't make it, and our gap between rich and poor is at the highest ever. So his prophecy about what could destroy America and what is destroying America is as prescient and relevant today as it was when he was calling for a poor people's campaign back then.
Dr. King and President Obama are two of the three African Americans who have won the Nobel Peace Prize. In Oslo, the president underscored his connection to Dr. King and his legacy by saying,
"We must begin by acknowledging a hard truth. We will not eradicate violent conflict in our lifetimes. There will be times when nations, acting individually or in concert, will find the use of force not only necessary, but morally justified. I make this statement mindful of what Martin Luther King Jr. said in this same ceremony years ago. Violence never brings permanent peace. It solves no social problem. It merely creates new and more complicated ones. As someone who stands here as a direct consequence of Dr. King's life work, I am living testimony to the moral force of nonviolence. I know there's nothing weak, nothing passive, nothing naive in the creed and lives of Gandhi and King.
If the president had left it there, he might not have generated the disappointment some in King's circle felt after hearing this.
But as a head of state, sworn to protect and defend my nation, I cannot be guided by their examples alone. I face the world as it is and cannot stand idle in the face of threats to the American people. For make no mistake, evil does exist in the world. A nonviolent movement could not have halted Hitler's armies. Negotiations cannot convince al-Qaeda's leaders to lay down their arms.
While examining beyond Vietnam, those we talked with took exception to President Obama's implication that the current climate of terror outstrips what Dr. King and his generation faced, and that Dr. King's steadfast adherence to nonviolence is an idealistic impossibility for any president. Harry Belafonte speaks for those who knew Dr. King best.
Let me just say this about Vietnam and his speech. I don't think any people have known a terror greater than have black people known in America throughout a number of centuries. And this is not to play heads up. It is not to say whose suffering was the greatest. This is not to dismiss what took place at Dachau and Auschwitz and what the Nazis did and what the Japanese did in forced marching. This is not about that. This is about the fact that Dr. King understood terror. He lived with it every day. His home was bombed. It was no Twin Towers, but it was a bomb. His house was wrecked, and his wife and his children's lives were in jeopardy. He had been, on many an occasion, driven off the road. People tried to do things to him, and he looked around him, and he saw a lot of murder. Terror is terror.
He was stabbed.
Yes.
Here in New York.
Stabbed here in New York, in Harlem. So violence and terrorism was not an abstract. For anyone to suggest that there is some current design on terror that would overwhelm Dr. King and not have him philosophically ready to encounter a debate on it is somehow somewhat specious.
Of course, the argument has been made that no American president could truly embrace nonviolence as a response to international realities.
I think that they're in very different lanes and they have very different callings. Barack Obama presently is the brilliant, charismatic, smiling, friendly face of the American empire. Martin Luther King Jr. was the courageous, sacrificial, smiling, friendly face that was crushed by the American empire. The latter is a prophet. The former is politician, you see. Now, Barack Obama might be preferable to other politicians, but he still is in the space where the pharaohs of empires reside. And Martin Luther King Jr. is out calling, "Let my people go," for anybody in that imperial space.
I don't think the issue is just being a pacifist. That's not what Dr. King called on everyone to be. He called on everyone to put justice at the center, and he said that violence does not create justice.
King's friend and fellow activist Tony Bennett was one of the first non-African Americans to be on the front lines of the civil rights movement. He had seen the horrors of combat up close as a soldier during World War II.
I don't think there's never been a good war. There's never been one. It's the height of ignorance. I mean, it's legalized murder. You're killing somebody. I mean, your mother teaches you to believe in God. And then at 17, they say, now we're going to show you how to kill. Now, it's too schizophrenic. It doesn't make sense. We should believe in God, believe in being a human being, and giving to the earth instead of taking from it.
The fallout from beyond Vietnam continued to plague Dr. King in the last year of his life.
He had to check the strength of his faith. Because we would often go to churches and they would not be full. Ministers would not show up, would not open doors to their churches. The Democratic Party almost en masse turned against him. Blacks who worked for the White House turned against him. So it was a lonesome journey. But the more he became accustomed to it, he gained strength even in his solitary role, because he felt that he was right and ultimately that the right would prevail. And that became his ultimate strength, because he said, I'd rather live with my conscience than live with the crowd. And leaders at their best, he said, cannot follow opinion polls. They must mold opinion.
When Dr. King was assassinated on that balcony in Memphis, nearly 3/4 of Americans disapproved of his stance against the Vietnam War. Many within the African-American community also criticized King. To young people like those in Newark, King at 38 was already a relic. They thought he'd gone soft. The Black Power movement was coming on. In the last year of his life, this question remains: who was on Martin's side?
We know when he was shot down, they had 72% disapproval ratings in the country, 55% disapproval ratings in Black America. That what they saw was Martin Luther King Jr. bearing witness, being a sermon, living his life, a committed life. That's what he wanted to leave behind, a committed life to justice, which pit him against the same Johnson administration who had courageously supported the Black freedom movement against white supremacist terror in the South, the civil rights movement against Jim Crow in the South. And so again, you see the connection of thought and action, theory, praxis, concept and deed, witness bear as well as a truth teller. And of course, we got to keep in mind that this great truth teller was called the most notorious liar by the FBI.
And the most dangerous man in America.
That kind of love is dangerous. When you love poor people that much, working people that much, you're going to be dangerous to the powers that be.
While King's faith never wavered in the last months of his life, those closest to him were well aware of his bouts of depression.
Well, he was definitely getting lonelier. Remember, from the pinnacle of this great movement in Selma that brought people from all over the country down there to march, and journalists from all over the world to crusade for Voting Rights Act. That had only been a couple of years before. The movement had splintered over whether he should go north. The movement had splintered over Black Power. Then he had to take on the war, and finally he had to take on the Poor People's Campaign. By the time he did that, he was very, very isolated and lonely, and the depression, the bouts of depression continued. I think they became stronger, and as they became stronger, I think he was driven more by conscience to make more of a witness.
Jesse Jackson remembers a crucial meeting of family and friends.
We got at the meeting earlier one Saturday morning, and he came in the meeting and said, I've had a migraine headache for about 3 days. And I thought about quitting. Maybe I've done as much as I could do in 13 years. We've come from the back of the bus, we have public accommodations, we have the right to vote. my Democratic friends, even some of my Morehouse classmates have turned against me. I felt real down. I felt depressed. Maybe I should quit, and everybody got real quiet. Then he said, but you know, just like down in Georgia, we can turn a minus into a plus. We got to go on to Memphis. He preached himself out of a depression. He went from, I should consider quitting, fast upon the death, but we have to go on to Memphis. And I took copious notes. It was much like, Jesus, let this cup pass from me. Maybe I've done the best I could do. You know, I've stilled the wind, I've walked the water, I've healed the sick, I've tried to do my Father's will, and I'm not understood even by my own family members. And then as he prayed, disciples slept, and then not my will but thine be done. I saw him walk out of that depression with that sense of go ahead, because it was a very tough time, because he was in real isolation, because sometimes the road to ultimate change, and that is that tension between politician and prophet. That is a real tension.
All of this begs the question, if Martin King were alive today, would his unrelenting insistence that there is a firm line between right and wrong find a willing audience? Or would his insistence on holding America's feet to a moral fire be seen as hubris?
Now, I've wondered sometimes going to King holiday celebrations whether King would be invited. I wonder sometimes going to the big mega churches, you know, who might have a Martin Luther King celebration. Well, Martin Luther King shows up. Says, I'd kind of like to speak at my celebration. They'd ask, well, what are you going to say? Well, I'm going to speak out against poverty and injustice and the wars that are going on. Well, you know, we've invited these political leaders, and they might be embarrassed if you talk about that. You know, you just wonder whether he would be welcome at Martin Luther King Day.
Every year now, ever since the 25 years we now celebrate the anniversary of King's birth, that you get this transformation of Brother Martin into Santa Claus with that lovely smile, with toys in his bag. Everybody is smiling, glad to see him, as if he wasn't a freedom fighter who was unnerving and unsettling and unhousing elites, making them shake in their boots, and they haunting him down every day from December of 1955 to his death, April 4th, 1968. So he undergoes Santa Clausification. That's one of the ways in which you defang and domesticate people who are on fire for justice.
What became clear to me as our conversations drew to a close was how profoundly influenced everyone who had come in contact with Dr. King was, whether or not they knew him personally, as so many we talked to did, or just came to know his life and words through the prism of history.
So what I have always had to do was to concentrate on what ML would do and what he would want, rather than showing my anger. Because to tell you the truth, a lot of it is still in me. Mm-hmm. Listen, if he could take what he took, there's nothing that I can't take.
You know, it amazes me when I hear 50 Cent or some other rappers talk about how hard they are. They're tough, they're brutal, they're gonna stand up. I'm the greatest thug in the world. You're a chicken. You chump change. Martin Luther King Jr. in the face, in the teeth of the battle of America, perpetuating in his mind the greatest form of violence against a vulnerable victim, said that America was the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. That was huge. That was incomparable.
Dr. King had a vision for the future. He held up something. He didn't simply scold us. He did, of course, and he should, and he was right to. But he also had visions for us. And he himself was that kind of vision. You heard Dr. King, you looked at him, you were inspired, and you thought, how extraordinary that it's possible for a human being to become a Martin Luther King. That's remarkable. If that's possible, then other things are possible. We need those visions. We need the inspiration.
We decided to conclude our conversation about Beyond Vietnam where it began, with Dr. Vincent Harding, the primary architect of this important speech, and the connection he believes it had to Dr. King's death 1 year to the day later.
I am convinced that that bullet had something to do with that speech. And over the years, that's been quite a struggle for me.
In his grief, Vincent Harding turned to Reverend James Lawson, who was also struggling with his own sense of guilt. It was Lawson who'd asked Dr. King to come to Memphis to support the striking garbage workers. Less than a week later, Martin Luther King Jr. would be assassinated while standing on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis.
And still wrestling with my own difficulties. One day I was on the phone with Jim about something or another, and I said to him, Jim, how do you feel about the fact that you were the one who invited Martin there? How have you dealt with that? And Jim, being the wonderful pastor and friend that he is, he's probably picked up what I was trying to struggle with. And he said, Vincent, what was clear to me was that Martin wanted to come to Memphis. He said, when I first called Martin to invite him, he was in a staff meeting. And I could hear the voices just booming onto the telephone. Martin, tell him you can't come, Martin. We've got too much to do, Martin. Just say no, Martin. And he said, Martin paid no attention and said, okay, Jim, let's arrange it. That told me that I was not coercing Martin, I was not forcing Martin, it was not me primarily. Martin saw those garbage workers and knew he wanted to stand with them, knew he needed to stand with them. So I do not take that on my own shoulders, Vincent. And that was a kind of burden off of my shoulders because I too knew that this is what Martin wanted, needed to say. And with all the people who said he shouldn't, if he was willing to go up against them, then it was a privilege for me to go with him.
Despite the negative repercussions that followed his Beyond Vietnam speech, Dr. King never retreated from his conviction that America had somehow lost her moral compass. In fact, Dr. King had resolved that come Sunday, April 7th, 1968, his sermon topic would be Why America May Go to Hell.
Now let us begin. Now let us rededicate ourselves to the long and bitter but beautiful struggle for a new world. Shall we say the odds are too great? Shall we tell them the struggle is too hard? Will there be another message of longing, of hope, of solidarity with their yearnings, of commitment to their cause, whatever the cost? The choice is ours. Though we might prefer it otherwise, we must choose in this crucial moment of human history.
I have often said that I consider Dr. King to be the greatest American that we've ever produced. His extraordinary courage, conviction, and commitment to peace in a time of violence is, to my mind at least, unequaled. Today, his life and legacy continue to challenge us to think more deeply and to act more honorably, particularly in light of our current wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the deep philosophical and economic divisions here at home. Thank you for joining me.